When we talk about slavery, the mind paints a familiar picture. A white man with a whip, chains glinting in the sun, a master barking orders across a cotton field. But there's another figure history softened, the one standing just behind him, the white mistress. She smiled in portraits. She poured tea from silver pots. She hosted charity luncheons and read verses about mercy. Yet behind those lace gloves was another kind of power, quieter, colder, more intimate. White women, daughters of the planter elite, inherited human beings as if they were heirlooms, slaves gifted like pearls, servants assigned like furniture. They were taught from birth that control over black life was not just permitted, it was their inheritance. She is 8 years old, holding a doll in one hand and another child's hand in the other. Both are called hers. One is made of porcelain. One breathes. That is how power first entered her bones. By the time these girls became women, cruelty wasn't something they learned. It was something they perfected. The plantation was a kingdom, and every queen ruled her corner with whatever tools control required. When her husband was away at war or asleep from drink, she watched the house, the fields, the lives within them, and she learned that silence, not shouting, could keep people afraid. There was one such woman remembered only in fragments, Miss Annie of South Carolina. She lived in a house white as her dresses, surrounded by fields that stretched farther than a man could walk in a day. To visitors, she was gentle. To the people she owned, she was a weather, unpredictable, impossible to escape. They said when anger found her, she'd order the yard cleared and bring out a barrel. What she did next has been told in whispers through generations, not for spectacle, but because remembering keeps truth alive. Miss Annie believed suffering taught obedience. Her punishments were arranged like ceremonies, calm, deliberate, efficient. No yelling, no frenzy, just method. She would say, "I do not punish from hate. I punish to remind them who they belong to." Those words traveled through the quarters like a chill, because every enslaved person knew belonging was the heart of her faith. To her, mercy was weakness. Control was duty. Historians once argued that white women were victims too, trapped in marriages, limited by men. There's truth in that. Patriarchy shaped them, but it also shielded them. And many learned how to wield its protection as a weapon. They could harm and be excused, command and be called delicate. Their tears could rewrite entire stories. A man's cruelty was condemned as brutality. A woman's was dismissed as discipline. In the archives, we find their handwriting everywhere: ledgers, bills of sale, letters to traders. In 1 year alone, over 40% of documented slaveholders in the South were women. They signed receipts for bodies the way one signed for furniture deliveries. Power, they learned, was survival. And when society gave them no path to independence except through ownership, her husband might manage the fields, but she managed the people inside the house. The cooks, the maids, the nannies who raised her children and buried their own. She saw everything. Who lingered too long, who looked too proud, who dared to sing when the day's labor was done. Every look could be misread as defiance. Every silence could be mistaken for plotting. And in a world where whiteness was law, accusation was enough. Sometimes she punished herself, not with guilt, but with prayer. She'd kneel and whisper, "Lord, teach me to rule as thou rulest over me." It was theology twisted into tyranny. This is a part of slavery that textbooks glance over. The part where lace meets leather, where gentility masked violence. Because the South built its identity on the myth of a fragile white woman, pure, passive, needing protection. To admit her complicity would unravel that entire myth. So history silenced her crimes and crowned her innocence. She became the symbol of purity in every novel, every film, every plantation tour. But beneath those whitewashed stories lies the truth. Many of those women weren't bystanders. They were the daily managers of terror. Their voices set punishments in motion. Their decisions decided who lived and who vanished into the fields forever. If we look closely, we see how violence wore refinement like perfume, how cruelty smiled through porcelain teeth, how grace could stand beside horror at the same breakfast table. These women's power wasn't the loud kind. It was the power of routine. the power of knowing that no one questioned them, the power of hands too clean to show the dirt they commanded. When the Civil War ended and the plantations fell, their portraits remained, painted faces staring down from museum walls, unbothered, untold. But behind those frames lies another story. The story of Miss Annie and countless others like her, women whose elegance had empire, whose gentleness masked iron. And for the men they ruled, for the women they controlled, survival meant reading every twitch of her smile, every tone in her voice. Because punishment could come from kindness as easily as from rage. That is the untold chapter of American slavery. The mistress, not a shadow of the master, but a master in her own right. Her power was not loud. It was whispered through lace and hymns and lullabies. And in that world, to be a black man under a white mistress meant facing a power that could punish you or possess you. The hand that held the whip could wear a wedding ring or lace. When we talk about the cruelty of slavery, people picture white men in broad hats, barking orders, cracking whips. But what happens when the whip is held by someone in a silk dress, when cruelty comes smiling through perfume and pearls? In the plantations of the American South, white women weren't silent witnesses. They were active participants in the system of terror. Not all, but many, too many. By the mid-1800s, nearly 40% of all slaveholders were women. That number alone shatters the myth of helplessness. They weren't the passive victims of patriarchy we were told about in history class. They were enforcers of empire, guardians of the Southern way of life, and protectors of their own fragile power. For women like Miss Annie of South Carolina, control was everything. Her husband oversaw the fields. But the house? That was her domain. And what happened in her domain stayed there, unrecorded, unpunished, unseen. She didn't just order punishments. She designed them. Miss Annie was known for her barrel. A cruel invention, a wooden barrel with nails hammered through from the outside in. The enslaved person would be forced inside, the lid sealed, and the barrel rolled down a hill. No one who survived forgot the sound. The children of the plantation whispered about it like a ghost story. The enslaved prayed never to hear the scraping of that wood. Cruelty, for her, wasn't rage. It was routine. And that's what makes her story, and the stories of thousands like her, even more terrifying. Violence didn't need shouting. It wore lace. It whispered, "I own you." Historians once painted white mistresses as tragic figures, women trapped by patriarchy, lonely, powerless. But plantation records tell a different story. They weren't powerless. They held life and death over human beings. They wrote ledgers, counting, buying, and selling children. They scolded enslaved girls for crying, punished them for beauty, punished them for existing. In their letters, they complained not of guilt, but of disobedience. One wrote, "I had to sell the girl for giving me too much trouble. She would not stay in her place." That girl? 14 years old. This was not madness. It was maintenance, the maintenance of power. White women had been told from birth that black people existed beneath them. Their dresses were sewn by enslaved hands. Their babies were nursed by enslaved women. Their comfort came from the exhaustion of others. And when that illusion of control was threatened, when an enslaved person looked them in the eye or hesitated before obeying, that's when their power turned violent. They called it discipline, but it was revenge. Revenge for living in a world where their husband had the final say, so they ruled those who could not say no. One historian described it best. The white mistress learned to mimic the master, because cruelty was the only form of authority she was allowed. And yet, beneath all the whippings, the punishments, the rigid smiles, something else was happening too, something even darker. Because when you give someone unchecked power over another person's life, their worst instincts don't just surface. They grow. Imagine being an enslaved man, working from dawn till the moon rose. The master's eyes on your labor, the mistress's eyes on your obedience. She could ruin you with a single word or a single desire. If you didn't smile when spoken to, you were uppity. If you smiled too much, you were bold. If you were strong, you were a threat. If you were weak, you were useless. There was no safety in your skin. The plantation wasn't just a system. It was a stage, and every black body had to perform submission. And the white mistress was often the director. Miss Annie, they said, would punish a man not for rebellion, but for silence. If he didn't answer fast enough, she'd accuse him of disrespect. If he spoke too fast, she'd call it insolence. Either way, the whip waited. For her, domination was not just expected, it was entitlement. By the time these girls grew into women, cruelty wasn't something they had to learn. It was something they inherited. Their mothers taught them how to smile through punishment. Their fathers taught them that mercy was weakness. And the enslaved, the ones who cried, who bled, who suffered, became mirrors reflecting back the ugliest truths of white womanhood. Today, when we look at old paintings, women in lace gowns, parasols in hand, standing before their plantations, we rarely see the blood behind the beauty. But every thread of that lace was stitched with silence. Every portrait was painted in the shadow of pain. Because the truth is this: the South was not built by men alone. It was built by the hands of black people, sustained by the fear they lived in, and maintained by women who understood that gentleness was a privilege of the free. The hand that held the whip could wear lace, and sometimes it did. Behind every charming smile at a plantation dinner was a quiet threat. Behind every polite "yes, ma'am" was a memory of pain that had no witness. The white mistress's rule was not always loud, but it was constant. She was the architect of order, the enforcer of silence, and the protector of her own reflection in a world built on lies. And when the world finally began to question slavery, when whispers of abolition reached the South, many of these women became its fiercest defenders, because if slavery ended, so did their power. But there was another kind of domination, one even more hidden, more humiliating, and far more taboo. History told us white women feared black men, but the truth is more complicated and far darker. For centuries, we were told a story that made sense to white America, that white women were the victims of black male aggression. That myth became the backbone of lynching, segregation, and terror. But buried beneath the propaganda is another truth, one history refused to touch. The truth that some of those same women who cried fear once used power to violate, to control, to silence. In the hidden corners of the antebellum South, a second kind of violence thrived, a violence that had no name. Because how do you name it when a system already denies your humanity? Enslaved black men were property, and property cannot be violated. Property cannot say no, but they could feel, they could fear, they could be forced. In the journals of white women, in letters long forgotten in dusty archives, you find traces of it, never stated, always implied. A woman writing to her sister complains that her boy no longer obeys her orders. She wonders aloud if he needs correction. A week later, the same name appears on an auction record. Sold to another county. The reason? Unmanageable. But the plantation whispers tell another story. They say the woman had grown too attached. They say he had refused her advances. And refusal, in a world where whiteness was law, was rebellion. To say no to a white woman was to risk death. To say yes was to lose your soul. Historians estimate that thousands of enslaved men experienced sexual coercion at the hands of white women, but there are no official records, no testimony in court, no justice. Because who would believe a black man in 1850, even if he dared to speak? The law defined him as property. His body belonged to whoever held the deed. If a mistress wanted him to come to her room at night, he went. If she touched him, he stood still. If she whispered threats about his family, he listened, knowing one wrong word could end their lives. It wasn't desire. It was domination. This was not romance. It was ritual, one that turned the enslaved man into both tool and target. Because when morning came, he would be called a beast. She would call herself tempted, and the system believed her. Harriet Jacobs, an enslaved woman who escaped and later wrote incidents in the life of a slave girl, told of one such story, one few dare to repeat. She wrote of a young white woman who impregnated herself by force with her father's enslaved man. When the pregnancy showed, the father did not shame his daughter. He punished the man brutally. The man was whipped nearly to death, his body destroyed, his dignity erased. The daughter soon became his sentence. This was the twisted heart of white supremacy, the power to sin and still be called innocent. These stories weren't accidents. They were part of a pattern. White women in slaveholding families grew up surrounded by a paradox. They were told they were fragile, yet they wielded absolute power over others. They were called pure, yet they lived in a system that defiled everything it touched. That contradiction festered. It warped love. It poisoned empathy. And when the human heart mixes shame with control, something monstrous is born. Imagine the psychological violence of that world, where a black man could be forced into submission at night and lynched for accusation by morning. The same system that excused white women's cruelty now weaponized their innocence. One false cry of fear from a white woman could erase a man's life. And so, silence became survival. Those who endured these abuses never spoke of them. They carried that pain in their bones, their eyes, their posture, but never their tongues. Because what language could describe it? What courtroom would listen? Even after freedom came, those wounds remained wordless. The trauma became generational, unspoken, inherited through shame, through the careful ways black men learned to exist near white women, distant, cautious, guarded. They told us black men were predators, but they never told us how often they were prey. After the Civil War, as the South scrambled to rewrite its image, white womanhood became its holy shield. The same hands that once held whips were now painted as symbols of purity, frailty, and virtue. It was a national rebranding, the South's greatest PR campaign. White women became the face of Southern innocence, and black men, they became the new monsters. Newspapers told lurid tales of black brutes. Lynch mobs claimed they were protecting white womanhood. Politicians used it to justify segregation. It was a perfect lie, built on centuries of unspoken truth. The crime of the past became the myth of the future. The same white women who once used black men's bodies became the symbols used against them. It was not just hypocrisy. It was generational gaslighting. And it worked. For 100 years, the image of the pure white woman and the dangerous black man justified everything, from Jim Crow laws to public lynchings. But behind closed doors, memory survived. In family stories passed down in whispers, in eyes that lowered when certain names were mentioned, in the quiet grief of knowing that even your pain had been rewritten into someone else's purity. These were the scars the nation refused to see. Because to admit this truth, that white women, too, participated in the sexual violence of slavery, would mean confronting the foundations of racial mythology itself. It would mean admitting that white supremacy wasn't built by men alone. For the enslaved man, the torment was double. His body was policed by white men, and his dignity violated by white women. He lived in a trap no one spoke of, between fear and humiliation, between invisibility and accusation. And when freedom finally came, it brought no justice for that kind of wound. To this day, these stories remain buried, because even modern historians hesitate to say it out loud. There are no museums for these men, no plaques, no reckonings, but history whispers, in plantation diaries, in faded letters, in the silences between the lines of family genealogies. And if you listen closely enough, you can still hear them. The men who were used, beaten, silenced, and then called dangerous. To be used, beaten, and silenced, and then called dangerous. That was the cruelest lie of all. For more than a century, this story stayed buried. Not because it was false, but because it was too true. After emancipation, America needed a new myth to live with itself. So the South began to polish its memory. The white mistress became a saint of sorrow, the plantation a place of nostalgia. And the people who had endured it all, their truths were folded, edited, and erased. The newspapers called it reconciliation. In reality, it was a campaign of silence. Textbooks spoke of faithful servants, never of stolen childhoods. Church pulpits praised forgiveness, not accountability. Even the archives that kept ledgers of cotton and cattle refused to record what happened to human hearts. And in that erasure, a new danger was born. White womanhood, once a mask for dominance, was recast as something to defend. The same myth that once excused ownership now justified lynching. Black men, who had once been voiceless victims, were rewritten as threats. That lie was lethal. From Reconstruction to Jim Crow, it bled across generations, turning silence into a survival skill. Silence can be holy, but when it is forced, it becomes a wound. Our ancestors knew that speaking certain truths could cost lives. So they learned another language, coded hymns, whispered prayers, small resistances. They built churches that hummed with unspoken grief. They raised children who could smile under scrutiny. They survived by pretending not to remember. But trauma doesn't disappear when it's hidden. It seeps into the bloodstream of a people. It changes posture, temper, trust. It teaches caution where there should be peace. And yet, within that guarded quiet, something powerful took root, a will to live, to build, to heal. When the law would not protect them, Black communities became their own refuge. Freedmen pooled pennies to buy land for schools. Grandmothers taught scripture as a language of freedom. Fathers who carried invisible scars taught their sons dignity instead of despair. They believed, even without apology from history, that dignity could be rebuilt from ashes. Every storefront church, every worn Bible, every photograph of a Black family dressed in Sunday best was a declaration. We are still here. That is the miracle of survival, not the absence of pain, but the decision to keep loving life despite it. Now, the world is beginning to look again, carefully, nervously at the stories it buried. Archivists are opening boxes that were sealed for a century. Scholars are naming what was once unspeakable. Descendants are asking the questions their elders could not. And as the light returns, so does accountability. Because healing isn't forgetting. Healing is truth spoken without fear. It's giving names back to those who were reduced to silence. It's understanding that confronting injustice in the past is not an attack on the present. It's an act of collective maturity. The silence of our ancestors wasn't weakness. It was strategy. But today, breaking it is power. This is more than history. It's inheritance. The ghosts of that era still shape our conversations about gender, race, and power. Every time we challenge a stereotype, every time we refuse to be defined by someone else's comfort, we are breaking the same chains our ancestors could not name. Truth, when spoken with compassion, becomes medicine. And medicine, when shared, becomes movement. Because truth, no matter how deeply it's buried, still breathes. And when we tell it, we set our ancestors free. If this story moved you, if it made you think, question, or see the past with new eyes, then don't let it stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Teach it to someone younger than you. And subscribe to Hidden Black Stories. Because we're not just uncovering pain, we're uncovering strength. Every video, every voice, every forgotten name we restore is another step toward healing a wound that once defined a world. The past isn't dead. It's still teaching us how to heal.